In the heart of America, where the promise of freedom was written into the very fabric of our nation, where the Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men are created equal, there lived a man who embodied that promise. His name was Solomon Northup, a free man, a father, a husband, a musician, a citizen with rights, dignity, and dreams for tomorrow. But in 1841, that promise was shattered. That dream became a nightmare, and the rights he held as sacred as life itself were stripped away in a single, brutal moment. This is not just a story of one man's suffering. This is not simply another tale of slavery's cruelty, though it contains horrors that will shake you to your core. This is a testament to the human spirit's refusal to be broken. It is a mirror held up to America's darkest chapter, reflecting truths we must never forget. And it is a reminder that freedom, once taken for granted, can vanish in an instant, stolen by greed, protected by law, and defended by violence. This is the story of Solomon Northup, a story of betrayal and survival, of 12 years stolen from a life, of a man who refused to forget his name even when the world tried to erase it, of hope that survived in the darkest places, and of a truth that could not be silenced. Before we begin Solomon's journey, if you believe stories like this need to be told, if you believe history must be remembered, help us share Solomon's story by subscribing to our channel and turning on notifications. Every subscription helps us bring more forgotten voices back to life. Now, let's begin. Solomon Northup was born in July of 1808 in Minerva, a small town in Essex County, New York. The year of his birth matters because it tells us something crucial. Solomon was born after New York State began its gradual emancipation process. He was born free, not freed, free. His father, Mintus Northup, had not been so fortunate. Mintus had been born into slavery, owned by a family named Northup in Rhode Island. But when his master died, Mintus was emancipated in the man's will. He took the surname of his former owner, as was common practice, and carried his freedom papers north to New York, where he built a new life. Mintus was determined that his son would know nothing of chains, that Solomon would grow up with dignity, with education, with opportunity. And for 33 years, that's exactly what happened. Young Solomon grew up in the rolling hills and forests of upstate New York. He learned to read and write, skills that many free Black Americans were denied even in the North. He worked alongside his father as a farmer, learning the rhythms of planting and harvest. He worked as a raftsman, guiding lumber down the waterways that connected the interior to the markets of the coast. But more than anything, Solomon loved music. He had a natural gift for the violin, and his father encouraged it. By the time he was a young man, Solomon was known throughout Saratoga Springs and the surrounding communities as a talented musician. His fingers moved across the strings with grace and precision, bringing joy to weddings, dances, and holiday celebrations. People requested him by name. They paid him well. He had a reputation.
In 1829, at the age of 21, Solomon married Anne Hampton on Christmas Day. Anne was a woman of mixed African American and Native American ancestry, a cook of considerable skill. Together, they were a team. They were partners. They were in love. Solomon and Anne built a life together in Saratoga Springs. They had 3 children, Elizabeth, Margaret, and Alonzo. Solomon provided for his family through a combination of work, farming in the spring and summer, playing violin in the winter, taking whatever honest labor he could find. Anne worked as a cook in hotels and homes throughout the area. Their children attended school. They learned to read and write. They had friends. They had a home. They had what so many millions of enslaved people across the South could only dream of. They had freedom. But freedom in America in 1841 was a complicated thing. The nation was divided morally and legally over the question of slavery. In the South, millions of Black Americans were held in bondage, their labor building the wealth of a plantation aristocracy that grew rich on cotton, tobacco, and sugar. In the North, slavery had been gradually abolished, but racism and discrimination remained deeply entrenched. And everywhere, even in free states, there was danger. The Fugitive Slave Act meant that slave catchers could pursue escaped slaves into free territory and drag them back south. But even more insidious was the practice of kidnapping free Black Americans and selling them into slavery. It was profitable, it was common, and it was terrifyingly easy. Solomon knew this. Every free Black person in America knew this. That's why he carried papers, official documents that proved his free status. Wherever he went, those papers went with him. They were his protection, his proof, his shield. But paper, as Solomon would learn in the most brutal way imaginable, can be stolen. It can be destroyed. It can be ignored. And in March of 1841, Solomon Northup's carefully constructed life came crashing down.
It started so innocently, so promisingly. Two white men arrived in Saratoga Springs in late March of 1841. They introduced themselves as Merrill Brown and Abram Hamilton, members of a traveling circus. They were looking for musicians to join their company for a brief tour that would take them to New York City and then to Washington, D.C. They had heard about Solomon's reputation as a violinist. They offered him generous wages, far more than he could make from his usual work. The job would only last a few weeks, and then he'd be back home with money in his pocket to support his family through the lean months. Solomon's wife Anne and their children were away at the time, working in the nearby town of Sandy Hill. He saw no reason not to take the job. He was a free man with papers. He was traveling to the nation's capital, not to slave territory. What harm could come of it? Everything. Everything could come of it. Everything did. Solomon agreed to join Brown and Hamilton. The three men traveled first to New York City, where they spent a few days. The two men were charming, friendly, and professional. They treated Solomon as an equal, or so it seemed. They even helped him obtain free papers from the custom house in New York City, an additional layer of protection. Then they traveled on to Washington, D.C. Now, here's something you need to understand about Washington in 1841. This was the capital of the United States of America, the seat of government for a nation founded on the principle that all men are created equal. And yet, slavery was perfectly legal there. Slave pens operated within sight of the Capitol building. Human beings were bought and sold in the shadow of the monuments to liberty. Brown and Hamilton took Solomon to a hotel. They ate dinner together. They drank wine. The conversation was pleasant. The wine flowed freely. And then Solomon began to feel ill. His head spun. His vision blurred. The room seemed to tilt and sway. He made his way to his room, his legs unsteady, his mind foggy. He collapsed onto the bed. When Solomon Northup opened his eyes, his world had ended. He was in darkness. His head throbbed with unbearable pain. He tried to move and heard the clink of metal. Chains. He was chained hand and foot. He was in a cell, a slave pen, in the heart of the nation's capital. At first, he thought it must be some terrible mistake. When men came to his cell, he told them the truth. He told them he was Solomon Northup, a free man from Saratoga Springs, New York. He told them about his wife and children. He told them about his papers, his proof of freedom. Their response was a whip. They beat him savagely. They told him his name was not Solomon Northup, his name was Platt. He was not from New York, he was a runaway slave from Georgia, and if he ever spoke those lies again, they would beat him until he couldn't speak at all. Solomon learned quickly that in this place, truth was irrelevant. Justice was a fantasy.
The law, which was supposed to protect him, had become his enemy. Brown and Hamilton had drugged him. They had stolen his papers, and they had sold him to slave traders for profit. Solomon Northup, a free man, with a family, with a life, with rights guaranteed by law, had been kidnapped and was about to be sold into slavery.
He was held in a slave pen operated by a man named James Birch, one of the most notorious slave traders in Washington. Birch kept dozens of enslaved people in his pens, preparing them for sale to plantation owners in the Deep South. Men, women, children, torn from their families and sold like livestock. Solomon was placed in a cell with other captives. Some had been enslaved their entire lives. Others, like him, had been free and were kidnapped. They all shared the same fate now. They were property. They were cargo. They were goods to be transported south and sold to the highest bidder. After several weeks in Birch's slave pen, Solomon and a group of other enslaved people were transported by ship to New Orleans, Louisiana. New Orleans was the largest slave market in the United States. It was where the domestic slave trade reached its peak of efficiency and cruelty. On that ship, confined below deck in chains, Solomon Northup crossed from the world of the free into the world of the enslaved. With every mile that took him further from New York, from his family, from his life, his chances of ever returning home grew smaller. His name was taken from him. His papers were destroyed. His identity was erased. The law that should have protected him now made him property under the law of other men. Solomon Northup, free man, had become Platt, slave.
New Orleans in the 1840s was a city of contradictions. It was beautiful and horrifying, cultured and barbaric. Its streets were filled with music and laughter, and also with the chains and cries of human beings being sold. Solomon was taken to a slave pen operated by a man named Theophilus Freeman. Freeman was a professional, a businessman who dealt in human flesh with the cold efficiency of any merchant selling any other commodity. He inspected his merchandise carefully, looking for defects, calculating values. The enslaved people in Freeman's pen were cleaned, fed, and prepared for sale. They were made to look as healthy and strong as possible to fetch the highest prices. Men were examined for their muscle and capacity for labor. Women were examined for their ability to bear children. Families were separated without a second thought. Solomon watched as a mother named Eliza was sold, but her young son and daughter were sold to different buyers. The children were literally torn from her arms as she screamed and begged. Her cries echoed through the slave pen, a sound that Solomon would never forget. Her grief was absolute, and it was ignored. Solomon himself was purchased by a Baptist preacher named William Ford. Ford owned a plantation in the Great Pine Woods region of Louisiana, and he needed skilled laborers. He recognized that Solomon, despite being listed as Platt and supposedly from Georgia, was intelligent, educated, and capable of more than field work. In the twisted economy of slavery, Ford was considered a good master. He didn't beat his slaves excessively. He provided adequate food. He even held religious services and encouraged his slaves to attend. But understand this, there is no such thing as a good master. Ford owned human beings. He bought and sold them. He profited from their labor. And when he needed money, he had no hesitation in selling them. Solomon worked for Ford as a carpenter and supervisor. His intelligence and skill were apparent, and Ford gave him responsibilities. But Solomon never forgot who he was. He never accepted the identity of Platt. In the quiet moments when he was alone, he was still Solomon Northup from Saratoga Springs, New York, and he was planning. He tried to escape once during his time with Ford. He attempted to write a letter to his family and friends in New York, but the letter was discovered. It was a dangerous gamble. A slave caught trying to communicate with the outside world could be beaten, sold to a harsher master, or even killed. Solomon was lucky. Ford, perhaps recognizing the injustice of Solomon's situation, even if he wouldn't admit it, didn't punish him severely. But the escape attempt had failed. Solomon's time with Ford came to an end when Ford fell into debt. Ford had borrowed money using his slaves as collateral, and when he couldn't pay, those slaves, including Solomon, had to be sold. This is one of the great ironies of slavery. Enslaved people had no control over their own lives, but they could be used as financial instruments, bought, sold, mortgaged, and inherited like any other property. Solomon was sold to a carpenter named John M. Tibbets, and with that sale, Solomon descended from uncomfortable servitude into genuine hell. Tibbets was everything Ford was not. He was cruel, violent, and erratic. He drank heavily, he had a hair-triggered temper, and he hated Solomon from the beginning, perhaps because Solomon's intelligence and skill made Tibbets feel inadequate.
Tibbets set Solomon to work building a weaving house. Solomon, who had learned carpentry under Ford and had natural skill, knew that Tibbets' instructions were inefficient and would result in poor work. He suggested a better method. Tibbets exploded with rage. For suggesting an improvement, for daring to speak up, Solomon was to be whipped. Tibbets approached him with a whip and rage in his eyes, determined to beat him into submission. And Solomon made a choice that could have cost him his life. He fought back. When Tibbets raised the whip, Solomon seized it. The two men struggled, and Solomon, stronger and more capable, overpowered Tibbets. He took the whip from him and in a moment of justified fury, struck Tibbets with it. In the antebellum South, what Solomon had just done was effectively a death sentence. A slave who struck a white man, even in self-defense, even in response to injustice, was breaking the fundamental rule of the slave system. The punishment was death, usually by lynching. Tibbets ran for help, and soon two of his friends arrived with ropes. They bound Solomon's wrists and threw a rope over the branch of a tree. They were going to hang him. Solomon stood there, the noose around his neck, his toes barely touching the ground, and waited to die. He hung there for hours under the burning Louisiana sun. Other slaves passed by, going about their work, unable to help, barely able to look. They knew that intervening would mean their own death. Solomon's neck burned, his lungs screamed for air. His vision began to dim. He thought of Anne and his children. He thought of Saratoga Springs. He thought of his violin and music and freedom. And he thought that this was how it would end, lynched for the crime of defending himself. Dead and forgotten, his family never knowing what became of him. But he didn't die. A man named Chapin, an overseer who worked for William Ford but was supervising work in the area, arrived and cut Solomon down. Chapin did this not out of compassion, but because Solomon was still technically Ford's property until the debt was paid, and Chapin wasn't going to let Ford's property be destroyed. Solomon survived, but the message was clear. His life meant nothing. He was property, and property had no rights. Tibbets, humiliated and enraged, couldn't work with Solomon anymore, so Solomon was sold again, this time to a man named Edwin Epps. And if Tibbets had been hell, Epps was the devil himself.
Edwin Epps was a cotton planter, and cotton was king in the Deep South. The entire economy of the region was built on cotton, and cotton required intensive labor. Enslaved people worked from dawn until long after dusk, picking cotton under the relentless sun, their hands bleeding from the sharp bowls, their backs aching from bending over the low plants. Epps was a true believer in slavery. He believed with absolute conviction that black people were inferior, that they were meant to be slaves, and that it was his God-given right to own them and work them as hard as he pleased. He quoted scripture to justify his cruelty. He preached that slavery was ordained by God, and he was sadistic. He took pleasure in the suffering of his slaves. Every slave on Epps's plantation was required to pick a certain weight of cotton each day. The quota depended on the slave's capability. Strong men might be required to pick 200 pounds or more, women and children somewhat less. The cotton was weighed at the end of each day. If a slave failed to meet their quota, they were whipped, 10 lashes for every pound they came up short. If they exceeded their quota, Epps raised their quota for the next day, and if they then failed to meet the new higher quota, they were whipped for that. There was no winning. There was no mercy. There was only endless labor and constant fear. Solomon worked in those cotton fields for years. His hands, which had once danced across violin strings, bringing joy to celebrations, now tore at cotton bolls until they bled. His back, which had never known the whip when he was free, became a map of scars. He witnessed horrors that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He saw families destroyed. He saw children sold away from their mothers. He saw women assaulted by Epps and other white men with no recourse, no protection, no justice. And he saw Patsy. Patsy was a young woman, barely 20 years old, who was Epps's most productive slave. She could pick an astonishing 500 pounds of cotton in a single day, far more than anyone else. Her skill should have earned her some measure of safety, but instead it made her a target. Edwin Epps developed an obsession with Patsy. He assaulted her regularly, treating her as his property to use as he pleased. His wife, Mary Epps, knew about this and was consumed with jealousy. But Mary didn't direct her anger at her husband, she directed it at Patsy, demanding that the young woman be punished, beaten, and tormented for the crime of being victimized. One day, Patsy briefly left the plantation without permission. She walked to a neighboring farm to ask for a bar of soap. Mary Epps refused to provide soap to the slaves, and Patsy, desperate to maintain some shred of cleanliness and dignity, went to get some herself. When she returned, Edwin Epps was waiting in a drunken rage. Mary had told him that Patsy had gone to the neighbor's farm to meet with a man, a lie designed to inflame Epps's jealous obsession. Epps ordered Patsy to be whipped, and he ordered Solomon to do it. Solomon was handed the whip. He was told to strike Patsy with it, to beat this young woman whose only crime was wanting to be clean, to hold on to a shred of humanity in a world designed to strip it away.
Solomon had no choice. Refusing meant his own death and wouldn't save Patsy. Epps would simply beat them both. So Solomon, his heart breaking, his soul screaming in protest, raised the whip and struck Patsy. But he couldn't do it with the force Epps demanded. He couldn't bring himself to truly hurt her. Epps, seeing Solomon's hesitation, flew into an even greater rage. He tore the whip from Solomon's hands and beat Patsy himself. He beat her until her dress was soaked with blood, until her back was shredded, the flesh hanging in ribbons, until her screams faded to whimpers and then to silence, until she collapsed, barely conscious, her blood soaking into the Louisiana dirt. Solomon was forced to watch. He was forced to have been a part of it, and he never forgave himself for that, even though he had no choice, even though refusing would have only made things worse. The image of Patsy's suffering haunted Solomon for the rest of his life. It appears in his memoir, described in painful detail, not for shock value, but as testimony, as witness, as a demand that the world understand what slavery truly was. If Solomon's story is moving you, if you believe these truths must never be forgotten, help us share Solomon's story by subscribing to our channel. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss stories that matter. Your support keeps these vital histories alive.
For years, Solomon lived in this hell. Years of backbreaking labor, years of watching human beings treated as animals, years of seeing the worst of what humans are capable of doing to each other. But through it all, Solomon Northup never forgot who he was. He never accepted the name Platt. He never stopped believing that somewhere beyond the cotton fields, beyond the whips and the chains, his family was waiting for him. He never stopped hoping for freedom. And he never stopped planning.
By 1852, Solomon had been enslaved for 11 years. 11 years of his life stolen. His children were growing up without him. His wife was living as a widow, not knowing if he was alive or dead. And Solomon had nearly given up hope of ever seeing them again. He had tried to escape multiple times. He had tried to write letters. He had tried to get word to the north. But every attempt had failed. Louisiana was a long way from New York. There was no underground railroad reaching into the deep south, and a slave caught trying to escape faced brutal punishment or death. Then, in 1852, a man named Samuel Bass came to work on Epps's plantation. Bass was a Canadian carpenter, an itinerant worker who traveled throughout the South taking jobs where he could find them. And crucially, Bass was an abolitionist. He believed slavery was evil, and he wasn't afraid to say so, even in the heart of slave territory. Bass would argue with Epps about slavery, telling him that it was immoral, that no man had the right to own another. Epps, who considered slavery not just acceptable, but divinely ordained, thought Bass was a fool. But he valued Bass's carpentry skills, so he tolerated the man's opinions. Solomon, working near Bass, heard these conversations. He recognized something in Bass, a spark of conscience, a commitment to justice, and he made a decision. He took an enormous, life-threatening risk. One day, when they were alone, Solomon approached Bass and revealed the truth. He told Bass his real name. He told him about Saratoga Springs, about his wife and children, about his free papers and his kidnapping. He begged Bass to send a letter to the north. Bass could have refused. He could have turned Solomon in to Epps, which would have resulted in Solomon's death. He could have simply walked away and forgotten the conversation. He owed Solomon nothing. But Samuel Bass was a man of principle. He was moved by Solomon's story and outraged by the injustice of it. He agreed to help. Bass traveled to Marksville, Louisiana, and sent a letter to Solomon's acquaintances in Saratoga Springs. The letter was carefully worded to avoid revealing Bass's identity or putting Solomon in danger if it was intercepted. It simply said that a free man named Solomon Northup was being held as a slave in Louisiana and needed help. The letter traveled north, carrying with it 12 years of hope, 12 years of suffering, 12 years of a man refusing to be forgotten. When the letter reached Saratoga Springs, it came into the hands of Henry B. Northup. Henry was a white attorney and a relative of the family that had once owned Solomon's father. He was also a man who believed in justice.
Henry was shocked and outraged by the letter. He immediately took action. Under New York state law, the state had an obligation to assist its free citizens who had been kidnapped into slavery. Henry petitioned the governor for authority and funding to travel to Louisiana and retrieve Solomon. The petition was granted. Henry was given official documents and the authority of New York State to reclaim one of its citizens. In January of 1853, Henry B. Northup traveled to Louisiana. He had the name of Edwin Epps and the general location of his plantation, but finding one enslaved man among thousands in Louisiana was no easy task. Henry spent days making inquiries, following leads, until finally he arrived at Epps's plantation. When Henry knocked on the door and announced his purpose, Epps was stunned. Then he was furious. One of his most valuable slaves was about to be taken from him, and there was nothing he could do about it. The law, which had protected slavery, which had made Solomon property, was now finally on Solomon's side. Henry asked to see Platt.
Solomon was brought in from the fields, dirty and exhausted from a day's labor. Henry looked at him and asked him questions, testing to see if this was truly Solomon Northup. Henry asked about Solomon's family, about Saratoga Springs, about his life before, and Solomon answered every question correctly. He told Henry about his wife Anne, about his children, about playing violin at dances, about the day he left with Brown and Hamilton. There was no doubt, this was Solomon Northup. Epps raged and threatened. He insisted that Platt was his legal property, that he had papers of sale. But Henry's documents from New York State trumped Epps's bill of sale. The law, for once in Solomon's 12 years of captivity, was on the side of justice. On January 4, 1853, Solomon Northup walked away from Edwin Epps's plantation, a free man. 12 years. 12 years of his life stolen, but he was free.
The journey back to New York was surreal. Solomon traveled with Henry B. Northup, retracing the path that had brought him to Louisiana as a slave. But now he was traveling as a free man, with papers that proclaimed his status and protected his rights. Everything looked different through the eyes of freedom. The landscape was the same, but Solomon was changed. He carried 12 years of trauma, 12 years of memories that would never leave him. He had seen the worst of humanity. He had been beaten, degraded, and treated as property. He had witnessed horrors that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But he was going home. When Solomon arrived in Saratoga Springs in January of 1853, his family barely recognized him. He had left as a man of 33, in the prime of his life. He returned as a man of 45, aged by suffering, his body scarred, his spirit tested, but unbroken. His wife Anne had waited for him. She had not remarried, even though she had no way of knowing if Solomon was alive or dead. She had raised their children alone, working and praying for his return. His children had grown. Elizabeth, his oldest, was now a young woman. Margaret had married, and Alonzo, who had been a small boy when Solomon left, was now a teenager. Most heartbreaking and beautiful was his youngest daughter, Margaret. She had married a man named Philip Staunton, and together they had a baby. She named the child Solomon Northup Staunton, after the grandfather he had never met, the man who had been stolen away before the child was born. Solomon held his grandchild for the first time, this little life named in his honor, and wept. 12 years of his family's life had passed without him. Birthdays, holidays, milestones, all lost. He had missed watching his children grow up. He had missed being there for his wife. He had been robbed of time that could never be returned. But he was home, and he was determined that his story would not be forgotten. Within months of his return, Solomon decided to write a memoir. He partnered with a local attorney and editor named David Wilson, who would help him organize and publish his account. In 1853, just months after his return to freedom, Solomon published 12 Years a Slave, Narrative of Solomon Northup, a citizen of New York, kidnapped in Washington City in 1841 and rescued in 1853. The book was extraordinary. It was not a simple adventure story or a tale of suffering designed to elicit pity. It was a detailed, unflinching account of slavery as a system. Solomon described the economics of the slave trade, the methods used to control enslaved people, the daily brutality, and the psychological warfare designed to break human spirits. He named names. He described William Ford, John Tibbets, and Edwin Epps in detail. He talked about the slave traders in Washington and New Orleans. He held nothing back. And crucially, he described the suffering of others, not just himself. He told Patsy's story. He told Eliza's story. He bore witness for those who couldn't tell their own stories, for those who were still enslaved, for those who had died in bondage. The book became a bestseller. It sold tens of thousands of copies in its first year. It was translated into multiple languages. It joined the ranks of other powerful abolitionist literature, like Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, published the year before, and Frederick Douglass's autobiographical narratives. Solomon's testimony was powerful because it came from someone who had lived on both sides of the divide. He had been free, he had been enslaved, and he could compare the two from personal experience. He could say with absolute authority what freedom meant and what slavery destroyed. Solomon traveled throughout the North, speaking at abolitionist meetings, at churches, at public gatherings. He told his story to audiences who wept at his words and steeled themselves for the fight ahead. His testimony was a weapon against slavery, proof that even free Black Americans were not safe in a nation that allowed human bondage. He met other prominent abolitionists and activists. He became part of a movement that was growing stronger every year, a movement that demanded the end of slavery not at some distant future date, but now, immediately, without compromise. Solomon's work mattered. Every speech he gave, every copy of his book that was sold, every mind that was changed by his testimony, all of it contributed to building the moral case against slavery that would eventually lead to its abolition. But Solomon's story also led to attempts at justice. He tried to prosecute Merrill Brown and Abram Hamilton, the men who had kidnapped him. He tried to bring James Birch to justice, but the legal system that had allowed his kidnapping in the first place was not interested in justice for Black Americans. The trials went nowhere. Birch was never convicted. Brown and Hamilton disappeared. The men who had stolen 12 years of Solomon's life faced no consequences. This, too, was part of Solomon's testimony. The system was not just passively accepting of slavery, it actively protected it. It punished those who resisted and rewarded those who profited from human bondage.
Solomon's book was published in 1853. 8 years later, in 1861, the United States plunged into civil war. The war was not initially fought over slavery, but over the question of whether states could secede from the Union. But everyone knew that slavery was at the heart of the conflict. The South's economy, its political power, its entire social structure was built on the institution of slavery. The North was increasingly unwilling to tolerate slavery's expansion and eventually its existence. Over 600,000 Americans died in that war. Brothers fought brothers, families were torn apart, cities were burned, the nation bled. But when the war ended in 1865, slavery was abolished. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution made it illegal throughout the United States. 4 million people who had been held in bondage were freed. It's impossible to know exactly what role Solomon's testimony played in bringing about that change. But we know that books like his, testimonies like his, mattered. They built the moral and political case for abolition. They made it impossible for Americans to claim ignorance about what slavery truly was. Solomon Northup, in writing his memoir and speaking his truth, became part of the force that eventually broke slavery's chains.
After 1857, Solomon Northup vanishes from the historical record. We don't know what happened to him. We don't know when or where he died. We don't know if he lived to see slavery abolished, or if he died before the war began. Some historians believe he continued his abolitionist work, traveling and speaking until his health declined. Others suggest he may have been kidnapped again and returned to slavery, silenced by those who hated his message and feared his influence. His death is unrecorded. His grave is unknown. The end of his story is a mystery. But perhaps that's fitting, because Solomon's story was never really about him alone. It was about the millions who suffered in slavery. It was about Patsy and Eliza and all the others whose names we'll never know.
It was about a system of oppression and the fight to destroy it. Solomon Northup's legacy is not in the date of his death, but in the power of his testimony. His words survived. His truth survived. And his refusal to be silenced, to be forgotten, to accept the identity that was forced upon him, that survived too. We remember Solomon Northup not because he was a victim, but because he was a survivor and a witness. He took the worst experience imaginable and transformed it into testimony. He used his pain to fuel the fight for justice. His story reminds us that freedom is fragile, that the rights we take for granted can be stripped away by greed, by hatred, by indifference, that the fight for justice, for dignity, for the recognition of our shared humanity is never truly over. Solomon Northup was born free. He was stolen into slavery, and he fought his way back to freedom. He lost 12 years of his life, but he gave us something invaluable in return: the truth. If Solomon's story has touched your heart, if you believe these histories must be preserved and shared, help us share Solomon's story by subscribing to our channel. Your subscription ensures that voices like Solomon's continue to be heard. Click subscribe now and join us in keeping these essential stories alive. In his own words from his memoir, Solomon wrote, "I had been a free man in the north, and now I found myself without law or justice, a slave in the south." And then later, "I can speak of slavery only so far as it came under my own observation, only so far as I have known and experienced it in my own person. And finally, I desire to be able to express to my fellow men my feelings while in a state of bondage, and to describe the horrors of their condition." Solomon Northup did exactly that. He bore witness. He told the truth, and in doing so, he became part of the force that eventually broke slavery's chains and redeemed, however imperfectly, the promise of freedom upon which America was founded. We remember Solomon Northup. We honor his courage, his resilience, and his refusal to be erased from history. Solomon Northup, a free man, a slave, a survivor, a witness, never forgotten.